World War I. It occurred over 100 years ago, but the technology pioneered by the Great War still shapes the battlefields of today. From the ashes of Passchendaele and Ypres came innovations like tanks, aircraft, and combined arms that still dictate modern warfare. Nearly every weapon and tactic pioneered in World War I, like massed artillery, tanks, and close air support, evolved and were used in conflicts all across the world in areas like the Pacific, Africa, and the Middle East, except for one. World War I was the first and last time poison gas was used in a modern war between industrial nations. After the scale of the devastation and the horrific injuries of World War I, chemical warfare was never used again. The idea of using toxic chemicals against enemies has been around for centuries, but World War I was the first conflict where chemical weapons could take advantage of the fruits of industrialization. In 1914, when the war began, chemical weapon use was limited to ineffective tear gas fired by German and French soldiers. These attacks were so ineffective that the soldiers manning the trenches didn't even notice it. Weapons like these were still used by both sides in a desperate attempt to break the stalemate in northeastern France. After these early failures, Germany would go on to utilize chlorine as a more effective chemical agent in their weapons. Like tear gas, chlorine is an irritant that damages the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs. However, unlike tear gas, chlorine is many times more powerful and is capable of killing humans in moderate amounts. The first use of chlorine would come on the 22nd of April, 1915, where 168 tons were deployed by German forces north of Ypres, causing the French troops to flee their trenches. Deadly chemical gas would continue to be used throughout the rest of the war as more nations began to develop new and improved chemical weapons. A memorable use of chemical gas occurred in 1917, when the German army used chemical weapons to attack a sector of trenches manned by American troops. The attack was documented by a doughboy soldier named Stahl Holt. Born in New York in 1896, he would go on to become an ambulance driver and later a pilot in the U.S. military. The following is from a letter Holt wrote about the war on September 1st, 1917. Dear Lois, Holt began his letter, written while he was in Paris on leave. I'm enjoying the luxuries of life, including ice cream sheets, cafes, and things. The French have a saying to the effect that no one comes out of Verdun the same. As the fighting is stiff there always, the statement is probably true for all times. It certainly is true of Verdun during an attack. It would take a book to tell about all that happened there. Now that it is over, it doesn't seem so bad, but during it we were almost exhausted. That was why I didn't write, and why it helped so to receive letters. I had a very close call with gas, which was used a lot, especially in our little valley that formed a pocket for it. It was just about dusk when we started, my 5th trip that day to the worst post the section has ever had, and we got without much excitement to within about 1,000 yards of the post, when a big motor truck 100 yards in front of me got hit by a shell. I couldn't get by, and there were too many shells coming in for everyone to try and clear the truck off the road, so I and this other fellow crawled in a trench alongside the road and waited. We huddled there a long time, getting splashed several times by mud thrown by shells exploding. When gas shells started to come in great numbers, I decided we had better go on to the post where we would be safer and from where we could warn others by telephone. When I was about buried by a shell, and a few seconds later a big gas shell went off within 20 feet of me. Something hit me on the head, making a big dent in my helmet and raising a bump on my head. If it hadn't been for my helmet, my head would have been cracked. As it was, I was dazed, knocked down, and my gas mask knocked off. I got several breaths of the strong solution right from the shell before it got diluted with much air. If it hadn't been for the fellow with me, I probably wouldn't be writing this letter, because I couldn't see. My eyes were running water and burning. So was my nose, and I could hardly breathe. I gasped, choked, and felt the extreme terror of the man who goes under in the water and will clutch at a straw. The fellow with me grabbed me and led me the 100 yards or so to the post where the doctor gave me a little stuff, and where I became alright again in a few hours, except that I was a little intoxicated from the gas for a while. I had other close calls, but that was the closest and shook me up the most. I think the hardest thing I did was to go back again alone the next night. I had to call myself names before I got up nerve enough. Of the 38 million casualties of World War I, over 1 million were caused by chemical warfare alone. The casualties of World War I are often called the lost generation, since the millions of young men that died made up a massive percentage of those who would have come of age in 1914 to 1918. Their deaths left a hollow reminder of the horrors of war, but their sacrifice was effectively nulled years later. On September 1st, 1939, exactly 22 years to the day Stull Holt wrote his letter regarding the fighting at Verdun, Poland was invaded and the war to end all wars began. Poison gas wasn't used militarily in World War II, partly because of its potential destructive power, but mostly because of its obsolescence against well-trained foes. The disuse of poison gas has led to battlefields with quicker, cleaner, and less painful deaths. At one point, chemical weapons were seen as the epitome of weapons technology, but they are now long forgotten by modern armies. If it took nukes to outshine chlorine, what would it take to make modern arms useless today?